Good morning, everybody. A warm welcome to all of you. I'm very happy that you made it. That so many. Good morning. Warm welcome to all of you. I'm very happy that so many followed our invitation to this corporate web multi-look, that you made it. I hope you hear me well and that we won't face major technical problems during the next hour and a half. I'm the managing director of ITSAB, an Austrian independent NGO in the field of business and development. And some 10 years ago, we initiated the corporate platform to strengthen the focus on business-oriented development cooperation here in Austria, to increase the awareness of Austrian companies of their role in global development processes, and to provide companies with know-how to better perform in socio-economic terms in developing countries. Our activities are made possible by leading Austrian companies together with the Austrian Development Agency, the Ministry for Economy, and the Austrian Chamber of Commerce. All of them are long-standing partners of the corporate platform, which now carry us through the difficult times of COVID-19. This web multi-look series, Doing Business in Africa, we organized together with Hans Stoisser and his platform NextAfrica. The idea is to offer tangible insights into relevant success factors for doing business in Africa, discuss how entrepreneurs can react and adapt to specific challenges and demands on this continent, and also to make us aware of the potentials for. I'm very much looking forward now to the keynotes from our distinguished guests. Thank you very much, Geoffrey Gangler and Andreas Ludwig, for joining us today. You have a lot to share on the topic of this web multi-look, collaboration in the new normality. And Hans Stoisser will introduce you both in detail, and before that, introducing also the topic of today's webinar. Thanks, Hans, now for taking over. Does he? Yeah, here he is.
Thank you, Bernhard. Thank you, Bernhard. Hello, my name is Hans Stoisser. I'm a co-founder of NextAfrica. A warm welcome also from my side. Together we go through these 90 minutes, and together we want to explore how the new normality for African-European cooperation will look like, the new normality after this pandemic, which might be, as The Economist, the British newspaper, said, a 90% economy. I'm actually broadcasting from Vienna, Austria. I'm still in my home office, yes. So are my colleagues from corporAID, Imke, Sophie, and Christoph, who make this webinar possible. This is our third webinar. Thank you for the feedback from all of you on the previous two. It is a test and learn for us. And so it is for you, I guess. All of us have made a huge leap into digitalizing our work environment and, most of all, virtualizing our communication. We're in the middle of that now. With these webinars, we are trying hard to improve so that we can together, then we can create a valuable experience for all of us. Our program of today, Collaboration in the New Normality, consists of 4 parts. Introduction, we are in the middle of that. And then as a second point, we have 2 top managers, one from Kenya, one from Austria, Geoffrey Gangler and Andreas Ludwig. They will provide us with keynotes. And then we have a second main part, which is interactions. So together with you, we want to engage you, to bring you we cannot really bring you on stage, but we want to have you to make questions. So, and with that, I want to get into some technical introduction very shortly. Housekeeping rules, as the British are saying. After this webinar, registered participants, and we have more than 100, will receive an email with the link where you will be asked for feedback and the link to download presentations. And now when you look on your screen, on your right side, you see 4 columns. One is chat. This is where participants can chat with each other. A second one is questions. This is questions for speakers. Please put here your questions for the speakers. And one important note, you can vote for those questions. We will ask on stage, we will take those questions first, who are voted most. Then you see the participants and poll. And there is one column with polls, and maybe at the beginning, we start with the first poll. May I ask Imke to put online the first poll? Yes. Is it online already? I don't see it. Yes, it is online. And now you are asked to vote. So this is so where do you join us from? It's from Austria, Kenya. Okay, some 3/4 of the people are coming from Austria. Yes. Okay, so we see 2/3 of the people from Austria, some from Kenya. So, and then we have a second question here. Okay, we do see it's some, where people are coming from. So our main participants are from Austria, but also some African countries are joining us. And in the registrations we have seen there's also other African countries. So the second poll, Imke, please, who of the non-African participants has done business in Africa already? Okay, I see the majority has done business in Africa. This is a good to know, but there's also some have not. Okay, thank you so much. So just to get an idea, so 2/3 of us, of Europeans, have done business with African countries, 1/3 has not. So, and let me ask now our 2 distinguished guests to come on stage. We are really honored to have 2 top managers with us, one from Kenya, one from Austria. First, Mr. Geoffrey Ganglia. Mr. Geoffrey Ganglia is one of Kenya's top managers. He's the CEO of Genghis Capital, a company investing and creating investment deals for customer-focused real economy undertakings. Mr. Ganglia has extensive experiences in mergers and acquisitions all over Africa, in more than 30 African countries. Jeff, hello, how are you?
Very well, Hans. It's a great pleasure to join you this morning, and good morning to our international audience.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. How is Nairobi? How is the situation?
Nairobi is pretty quiet. I think we have a bit of a partial lockdown, but also the general realization that I think COVID will be with us for some time. And so people are trying to see how to work within the guidelines issued by WHO. We are still working, but we keep a very skeleton staff in our office, maybe less than 5% of the complement, because by law, we are an essential service, so we have to stay open. Okay. But most of our staff are working from home, and maybe from a Genghis Capital point of view, about 3 years ago, we went on a full cloud-based solution for all our operations. And we found that transitioning from working into the office to working at home has been pretty seamless in that regard. So, in a sense, happy to have made that strategic decision 3 years ago, just building on the whole digitization theme.
So very much foresight, you can see from that point of view. So we are in a similar situation in Austria. Well, and secondly, I want to introduce one of Austria's top manager, Mr. Andreas Ludwig. He is the CEO and executive chairman of the Umdash Group since 2010 already. It's an international group, including the formwork specialist Docker, Umdash Store Makers, and Docker Ventures, with over 8,000 employees and over 170 facilities on 5 continents. The group is considered as one of Austria's famous hidden champions. You know, hidden champion in the real economy, a family-owned business in a certain market niche and leading this niche worldwide. Andreas, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Good morning. Thank you very well.
In one of your interviews, just one question. In one of your interviews, you said that the basis for success of your company, your 150-year-old company, has been entrepreneurial skills of vision and foresight. Isn't that something very much needed today?
Well, absolutely. I think it's always needed, obviously, but especially in very difficult times like right now. I think it's entrepreneurial spirit, it's courage, and it's a positive attitude. I think what we struggle most with during this crisis, obviously, is that it's new. It is a challenge which none of us has ever faced, and it scares people, and that makes it very difficult to get economic activities going again. So I think one of the big challenges will be, now that we seem to, at least in Austria, in some parts of the world, come out of the core of the lockdown, to generate some more confidence and optimism in people to not only consume but also invest, and that's at the heart of the entrepreneurial spirit.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. So let's hope to come back one day to 100% economy, yeah?
We'll see.
Okay, the program today is that first Jeff Gangler, Mr. Geoffrey Gangler, will give us a keynote of around 10 minutes, and then Mr. Andreas Ludwig will do the same. So, Jeff, your keynote will be about how Sub-Saharan Africa is doing with COVID-19, with this ongoing pandemic, where and which sectors people should invest, and what are the drivers for the African-European collaboration, leading us then to the post-pandemic new reality. Jeff, please go ahead with your keynote. Ilke, can you please put in the presentations? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Hans, for giving me this opportunity once again. And I just have a few slides which I'd like to talk to, just to give some context of where Africa is. I do live and work in Kenya more actively, though our firm also covers work around the greater East African region. But a lot of my references would probably, as one would expect, be drawn to what we are seeing in Kenya, because it's a lot closer to home. I think if you just look at a broad outlook of what's happening in Africa, obviously this is an unprecedented health crisis, and it has certainly put our infrastructure from our healthcare service provision under enormous pressure, just to be able to get all the PPEs that you need, to be able to get the testing done, and also preparing for hospitalization. I think the biggest constraint has obviously been, from a value chain point of view, the getting all these goods in and ensuring adequate protection for the staff. And also, healthcare was already severely underinvested even before COVID. And so this has just exacerbated that problem. With that situation, and with the measures put in place by governments, obviously there's enormous economic disruption at various levels. with the global supply chain, if you look at some of the countries which are big exporters of raw materials, be they minerals or oil and gas or even food products, that has been severely disrupted. But also a big part of Africa survives on trade, survives on daily wage. And to the extent that people are not able to work, that has an impact. We've also seen significant capital outflows from Africa in the last 3 months. I think the latest number I have is more than $5 billion has already left. This is mainly from our portfolio flows into some of the larger economies. We've seen the currencies already weaken, and that is expected to continue because there's very little forex being generated through exports. Overall, according to the IMF's latest survey, they anticipate growth in negative growth of about 1.6% overall for the continent. This was the estimate as of April 2020. And it's important to realize that Africa is not homogeneous. So this IMF sort of classifies the countries into 3. And depending on where your country falls, the impact varies. So we have the resource-rich countries, we have the oil producers, and we have the countries that are not major resource exporters. And as one would expect, the impact is much greater on the natural resource exporters, whether you're in the oil business or you're in the mining and metals business. You'll see a much greater impact. In those countries, probably going as high as -5% growth this year. For the countries which are more service-based, so a market like Kenya, we are looking at minimal growth, maybe about between 1% and 1.5%. Those are the latest estimates, even from our central bank. Because while there's disruption, already some of these countries were growing at about 6%. So early in the year, that was the expectation, but now it's come down to about 1%. The immediate pressure is obviously for government support in terms of being able to meet the additional healthcare costs, providing some sort of safety net for the most vulnerable groups, because most people are not able to work, especially the casual workers who work in sectors like construction, in manufacturing, where there's been closure of those entities and temporary layoffs. And governments are putting in place measures to maybe provide minimal support to these individuals. And a lot of the funding being raised by central government now is really to try to plug that hole so that to the extent possible, life can continue as it is. We have gotten good support from some of the multilateral agencies. I think the IMF has an accelerated program of providing fiscal support to help on this COVID situation. Our countries, though, are also reliant on raising funding from commercial sources, whether domestic or international. And in light of what's happening, I think it will just be a lot tougher to raise capital the way we've been doing in the past. So in a broad nutshell, those are some of what we are seeing across the continent from an impact point of view. If we turn to a sectoral view, tourism is obviously going to be one of the sectors that's hardest hit, and I think the countries which have the biggest negative growth are those whose economies is predominantly driven by tourism, the likes of Seychelles or Mauritius, because that industry has totally shut down. We touched a bit on the extractive industries, with global demand having reduced, demand from China having reduced, and you're seeing commodity prices have also come off quite significantly. So again, that will be a challenging sector in the short to medium term. Trade has become very important in Africa, whether it's intra-Africa trade or trade with Europe, trade with Asia, trade with the US, under the different protocols. And again, because of the disruption in the global supply chain, this has been affected quite adversely. However, we see that certain areas are still potentially attractive to investors. And we've tried to classify these in some of the key areas. And from an investment point of view, we see that these are the areas which would be quite important and will continue just by virtue of the fact that they really touch on basic needs rather than, can I call them, more luxury or items. So food security is obviously a very important theme, and one can play in this space in various areas, whether it's looking at farming techniques, whether it's looking at food processing opportunities, and predominantly for domestic consumption, and also obviously handling of agricultural produce. This has been one area of significant weakness, where close to half of the agricultural produce in Africa gets wasted because we don't have sufficient handling capability of that produce, and getting it to markets is very tough. So if one is looking at a place to play, these are obviously one area. The big problem, though, this year from a food security has been, we've had a bit of extreme weather, hot in some areas, flash floods in others, and we've had a locust invasion in northern parts of Africa as well, which may have some impact on the food security question. The second area where we're seeing a lot of activity is on the domestic manufacturing. With the COVID situation, we've seen a lot of disruptions in the global supply chain. And that means even just obtaining PPEs becomes difficult. We've seen a lot of local manufacturers diversify their product range to start producing some of these items. But also, most African countries have a deliberate strategy to grow their domestic manufacturing capability as a way of adding value to the produce they have, also as a way of creating jobs for the local market and better quality jobs. So we foresee this will continue to happen. And indeed, we've seen a lot of new entrants, even from international companies who come to set up, are also looking at manufacturing domestically. We've seen a lot of countries also set up special economic zones, which can then be attractive to the manufacturing sector. The third area which we still see a lot of opportunities for investment is in the social services. And in this area, I've grouped together education, healthcare, and housing, because these are three areas which have significant need, and government intervention has not been adequate. Indeed, a majority of the private sector or private equity funds that we see coming in partnership with companies already operating in, whether it's markets like Europe or Asia or even the Middle East, looking to invest in these sectors. And hardly any firm, hardly any investor do you talk to who doesn't have an interest in these particular areas. And we see private sector participation continue to grow. And also with the COVID situation, a sector like education, where traditionally we've all been going to class and the like, physical facilities, I think there's going to be a great push towards digital learning. And private schools have been at the forefront of championing this so that there's no significant disruption to the children in school. The big challenge is obviously how do you roll out similar programs to private, to public schools, which have the majority of the population. Infrastructure has changed enormously in Africa over the last, call it 10 to 15 years, but still grossly inadequate. I think today there was a breaking story in Kenya about PPP initiatives in the energy sector, where our state-owned power generation is still proceeding with plans for an additional 140 megawatts in the geothermal energy space, where they'll be working with a number of international companies. That's going through the tendering process. So despite the COVID situation, I think the need for quality and affordable energy to meet the needs of Africa continues. And it's not just for the big projects. We've also seen a lot of entrepreneurs, especially from Europe, come up with different home-based solutions for energy. So one should not just think about the big projects, but also look at home-based solutions, be they solar, be they wind, be they cooking gas-based solutions. Transport remains critical, and we're still seeing a lot of investment in this area just because of the huge legacy challenges that we've had. There may be a bit of a slowdown in the short term, but it's still a sector that is deriving, or rather is attracting quite a lot of capital. Just in speaking to even government and the plans that they have on a PPP basis in this regard. Telecoms has been one of the great success stories. And while we've increased coverage and penetration quite a bit, there's now the big question is really about affordability and what interventions can be made to further lower the cost of delivering telecom services. And with the digitization of many services being key, then the demand for telecoms is still growing. And then even with the flood situation in the country, I think it has just highlighted the need for further investment in ensuring a good environment and looking after the resourcing. So a lot of investors are putting emphasis from an ESIA point of view for anything that they invest in must have a strong environmental protection base. Then finally, financial services. And again, here there are very many verticals in which an investor can play. But some of the key themes remain the velocity of money. How do we make the shilling rotate a lot more, which then underpins trade as well? And access to credit. This has always been a challenge for SMEs, and we've seen numerous interventions, but still not enough. Our entities are still significantly underfunded, and so the question of how do you access credit becomes an important imperative for investors looking to play in that space. I think my overall view of this is whatever one wants to invest in, one should really look at products that are geared towards basically improving the quality of life for people living here, being competitive on a pricing point of view, and that will then ensure that across all these verticals, you're then able to have, can I call it, sustainable growth, and to take advantage of the pent-up demand in these categories.
Okay, so thank you so much, Jeff, for this overview on where and how to invest in this pandemic and the post-pandemic world. Let me just suggest now, this maybe before you come, you have a second part of your presentation. I know when it comes to European, African or African-European collaboration, but let me suggest to bring in now Mr. Ludwig. With his presentation, he has some concrete experiences on African-European collaboration and some ideas on that. And then we come back to your second part of your presentation. So, Andreas, may I ask you on stage, I unmute you, please.
Very good, thank you. Yes, I actually brought one slide along. I don't know if maybe you can put that on stage, which shows a little bit who we are and what we do. And I'm by no way an expert on Africa, other than being privately a big fan and loving to spend vacations exploring the African nature. But we have actually, for many, many years, done business in Africa. If you look at that map, the Umdash Group is, as you said in the introduction, a group of about 9,000 people with 1.5 billion in sales, in two basic units. On the left, you see Doka, which is our largest business, which is also the business which has been active in Africa. We supply forms for the construction industry. For all those who are not experts, forms are the things, are those wooden and metal parts where you actually pour in the concrete to build large structures. And on the other hand, the store makers is a very traditional business which builds stores, has not been active in Africa, is mostly European business with a little bit of activity in the Middle East. And in the middle, you see Ventures, which is a initiative or a group we set up 3 years ago with the idea to deal with the future of our two businesses, so construction and retail. And the reason I mention that is because I think maybe that is one of the answers how to do business in Africa. I have to admit that when Bernhard asked me to join these panels, I said, well, we actually are an example of a business which struggled in Africa for many, many years. We have had, if you see on the map, subsidiaries in Northern Africa. You see one of the spots, Libya. I remember many, many years ago, we got a big project to build a stadium together with an Austrian construction company in Libya, and then war broke out, and here goes the project. I think we have really struggled with what I would say is governance issues. We have a very strict and very straightforward business policy that we conduct business only to the highest standard of ethical, moral, and legal standards, which has been in many instances, unfortunately, a challenge if you supply the construction industry. And in general, the rule of law, I have to admit, has made it in some instances very, very difficult for us to conduct business in combination with this governance issue. Now, one of the characteristics of our business is that we supply these forms to our customers, and most of the time we don't sell it to the construction companies, we lease it to them. So that requires us to bring a lot of material into a country, and with that a lot of investment. And so what we need for our business model to work is a continuity of flow of business, because it doesn't make sense to ship forms in and out of countries. one of the problems in a lot of these African economies was that there was no consistency. You mentioned, Mr. Gangler mentioned large projects. Large projects are wonderful, but they have the problem that they start and they end. And in our business model, that makes it very difficult because I have invested into forms in a country. I win a large project. We build a huge mosque, I remember, in Algeria. And afterwards, what do? We have big projects right now in Egypt, but what happens after? So the lack of consistency has been a challenge for us. So we developed, and that's to me actually my main message. So when we started with Umdurch Ventures, we said, let's think about what a different future also in terms of business model might look like in different parts of the world. In particular for developing economies, we came up with an idea which is now being marketed under the brand name Neuland. The idea was quite simple, if you will. We thought about that one of the ways to change this dependence of large projects is to take a different approach to technology. So we developed a precast concrete factory, and instead of transport, which exists obviously all around the world, and one of the big challenge for precast concrete is the transportation of the parts once you precast them in the factory to a construction site. So we turned this business model around. We said, let's create a factory which is mobile. So this precast factory can be packed up in 25 sea freight containers, and you bring the whole factory to the construction site. So you no longer have to transport the concrete pieces, but you have to transport the concrete factory. And this is one of the, to pick up on one of the points Mr. Gangler had talked about. The beauty of this is that you can go wherever construction needs are, set up your factory, and then you create jobs locally and value add locally. You no longer import something, but you create it at the point where it's needed. So this technology of this mobile precast factory has been introduced into the marketplace last year, and we have had a huge amount of interest, also particularly from African countries. The most specific ones are actually in Ivory Coast, where there is projects of homes to be built in large numbers. And this is an ideal example where you could use this precast factory technology. Well, the biggest problem so far, and this is where I question a little bit of what Mr. Gangler said. The biggest problem we found is not so much the funding. In Ivory Coast, the government has been telling us, we have the money. We want to build 4,000 homes for members of civil servants and military personnel. The problem the country has is, how do you deploy those funds to make sure that they get used for those projects? So our specific example was, they're saying, would you be willing not only to supply us with the technology in this mobile factory, but would you also be willing to build those for us? And we are not a construction company, so we can't do that. But the biggest struggle the local authorities have is to find a reliable partner who not just takes the money and then it somehow disappears, but to actually use it for the purpose it has been designed for. So for me, I think this is a good example how you can respond to specific needs of in this case, African developing countries. And I think the biggest challenge remains to build governance structures in the countries which allow them to actually use this technology and deploy it at the point where it's needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. So this is quite a direct question to Jeff. What do you think about this project? And is it something you would invest in, or what's your comment on that?
Thank you, Mr. Ludwig, for your comments, and I also want to appreciate the diverse experience you've had doing business in Africa. And Africa is not an easy place to do business. But over time, I think the environment has improved considerably. And because of that, we've seen successes with the private sector investors, but they've also been places where one has not been very successful. I really like the concept of the mobile factory, which is then able to move to various locations where there's a need. Because you may manufacture something cheaply, maybe in Europe or other markets, but then the logistic cost becomes too high. Then secondly, what about the locals? There are 1 billion people in the continent who need to find a form of livelihood. So for one to really build sustainability, if such strategies can be pursued, then it makes a lot of sense for both parties and will be a win-win collaboration. The Ivory Coast problem is, again, is very common, that are not just for businesses, but also for private equity funds, and we work with a number of them. How do they identify the right partner whom they can work with in each country? And it is not a very long list of people who've proven themselves, who have the right credibility and track record, and not just managerial, but also the entrepreneurial streak that you need to be able to drive a business. And I'm also cognizant that most businesses fold within the first 2 to 3 years of operation. So when you get someone standing for 10, 15, 20 years, it says a lot about them. But I think there are pockets of local investors and institutions who would be able and who have a proven track record. And also we've seen generations. I think if you look at Africa, some of the big businesses today, I look at a country like Kenya, our second largest bank, Equity Bank, has operated as a bank only since the year 2004. So running for only 16 years. Today managing over assets of close to $7 billion. And this is a locally grown business which has been able to attract international investors. I believe Norfund today is one of the single largest equity holders, and they've had in the past Helios as an investor, which is a large Pan-African equity fund, and they've also had local investors. So partners are there, but there are not many. And really the task is, how do you identify and find the right partner, and how do you work closely, especially if you're an entrepreneurial business or looking to grow, maybe an industrial company. There may be merit in partnering also with a financial institution from your home country or your region, because then they probably may have had a lot more experience, not just in one market, but also working with different entrepreneurs in that particular country. And so they have a better and more real feel of who are the credible partners. Because really, a lot of it comes down to leadership is about the people. How do you get to know the good people? It's by piggybacking on the people who've been there before you and are able to then point you in the right direction, and also able to navigate some of the difficult situations.
Okay, so thank you. New generation and depending on the people, and there is not many. Andreas, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. But again, this is the struggle. I think as a foreign investor, it's almost impossible to find those. I think you need to have local networks, which if you use my example, if the government in Ivory Coast is struggling to find the right construction company to realize their project using our technology, how could I do that from Europe? So I think the challenge, the ball has to be played back. It has to be done locally. I'm a big a believer in it. You find those people locally who are reliable partners, and then you team them up with European players like us, and then I think, as you just described, I don't think the funding will be the problem.
Okay, yeah. So we are already now in the middle of the discussion, European-African collaboration. And maybe we could, Mr. Ludwig or Andreas, you have prepared something on that, and Jeff as well. And maybe, Jeff, you could continue now with your second part of your presentation, which goes exactly on that. And Imke, could you bring in, thank you, yeah. Please.
Okay,
Jeff, go ahead.
thank you. I think I've touched on some of the issues. For one, looking at how to collaborate in the market, and I think clearly expansion into new markets by exporting technologies. Interestingly, it's very much Mr. Ludwig's point of his own experience, and how does one do that? Secondly, obviously, access to products or even raw materials still remains a key driver. Innovation is absolutely critical, and Africa is not Europe, and Africa has its own challenges. One of the biggest being just low income across the board for population. So how do you design products which people who live on a daily wage can be able to afford and purchase? And two, with all these investments in infrastructure, how does that then become innovative? And I think over the last, call it 10 years, especially since the mobile revolution came, we've seen a lot of new business come in and changing the way we do things. And I think also, generally speaking, many African markets have been pretty receptive to new technologies, and people are quite sensitive to price point. So even as you innovate, you must ensure that whatever product you produce is going to fit the price points of the majority. Less than 2% of the population earns over $1,000 per month in a market like Kenya. So it just tells you that the businesses which have been successful are those that are able to innovate and really touch, call it the masses, who earn low incomes per day. Skill development is critical, and you're seeing a lot of emphasis on investment in education, and not just the white collar jobs, but also building the technical skills and to be able to execute projects. When we look at certain sectors, for a long time, I think we had only one or two local companies in a market like Kenya which had executed large-scale power projects. But I think with the growth in power, there's been a growing pool of local engineers who have now built the practical experience that is required for industries such as power generation. So this becomes a very important aspect for one to be able to really invest in the overall transformation of the countries. And eventually, the key will come down to what's the competitive advantage. And as Mr. Ludwig has pointed out, if you're able to deliver your product, which then say maybe lowers the cost of construction significantly, or reduces the time it takes to build, then that then has a real impact, and one can then be able to execute quite successfully. So a lot of the inward investment needs to look at that area. I think in closing, I just want to say that we've seen a big switch. I think Europe in particular still remains a major trading partner and also a source of investment capital, and that is likely to continue. We've had our traditional partners. I mean, if you look at the United Kingdom or the French, but also we've seen a lot more non-traditional investors coming in and looking for opportunities. Russia, Turkey, the Scandinavian countries have become very significant investors here. South America as well. We've seen deliberate efforts, especially from Brazil, to make investment in the region and have a mix of direct through the government, but also financial institutions beginning to play a much bigger role in the market. It just lends itself to the fact that people see the investment thesis for Africa is still strong. We see a lot of switch from what was traditional aid to more private investment, both government and companies raising capital and offering a commercial return. The cost of capital is still quite high in country. But again, there was a time it was not available, so it didn't matter. If you're able to get capital, it may be a bit expensive, but then it enables you move from point A to point B and reposition yourself for the future. We still see a lot of human talent being exported as well from an African point of view. With the economy is not able to absorb all the people who work, we've seen a really growing diaspora of not just unskilled, but also skilled professionals in different regions. And we think this will be part of Africa's contribution. If you look at our demographics, if you look at the equipping of skills, then this becomes one of the key things Africa will really bring to the table. And it is not a surprise that in a country like Kenya today, our single largest source of forex is not coffee or tea, but it's actually remittances from the skilled workforce, whether it's to support their families back at home or even for investment. A lot of the investors in our country today are also just Kenyans in the diaspora. And this is as a result of that exporting of human capital. And we've seen areas of great strength, especially in the ICT sector, where we've got quite a big pool of people out there who are really pushing this forward. And then finally, just in closing, is obviously there's need to work with local intermediaries who have good local knowledge and understanding of what can be done, and also who will be your boots on the ground as you continue. And it's good to have a company, but you'll need non-executive directors who come in handy. How do you tap into that network of people? You need professional advisors to assist you in executing some of the transactions and working within the local framework. You'd even need local management and the like. So one cannot underestimate the role intermediaries would play in terms of facilitating transactions. And we certainly as a firm would be ready and willing to assist in any way that we can. And we found that many investors typically piggyback on the back of that sort of network. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you very much. So when you talk about intermediaries, it comes back to partners. From the European point of view, it's the need for local partners.
Correct.
And also many things are burning down then on the competitive advantage of the, as you said, of the European company trying to invest, trying to do business with African countries in competition, and you mentioned that, with Russia and other countries or companies from those other countries, including Asia. You did not mention China in particular, but you said Asia. Thank you. Andreas, what would be your take on that? African-European collaborations, opportunities for European companies in African countries. What do you think?
Well, my answer again is only a very pragmatic business answer. What we have done, when I said we struggled, we found for example, for Sub-Saharan Africa, a partner company, local company in South Africa, which we actually sold our existing operations. We had businesses in Mozambique, in South Africa, in Nigeria. They took it over as a local company, and so they are now our partner. We supply technology, we supply products, we supply know-how, and they actually serve the local markets. This is a very pragmatic answer of collaboration, because I do not believe that the problem can be solved by setting up large countrywide organizations and do it that way. I think you got to find yourself a specific partner which can help you. I'm also a big fan of what Mr. Ganga said, to see if we can turn European money, which was originally dedicated for classic foreign aid, into investments. I think that is a wonderful idea to say, okay, we go, if the European funding of foreign aid programs can be turned into funding specific projects of companies or investments, which I think is even better than projects in local countries, that would be, I think, the much more effective or efficient use of funding. The last point you made, I have to disagree. I think it is very difficult for European companies to compete with businesses from China or even Russia. And I say something which is a bit tricky, but I think for exactly the same reason we struggled, because some of those businesses might not take the governance and corporate governance and local governance issues as seriously as we do. So I would avoid competition with Chinese. And I know this might sound a little bit like a stereotype, but the honest answer is I think it will be very, very difficult to compete on the same level. I think if we do want to compete, we have to compete on a different level, which is mainly on technology.
Would you agree with that, Jeff? Before we go to we will include then our audience and the questions here, already a couple of them. Would you agree with that European companies shouldn't compete with, or it's impossible to compete with, Chinese or Asian or companies from other countries?
I think obviously the Chinese companies are very aggressive, even in their pricing. If you see what they quote for construction, being one of them, it knocks off a lot of people. But in the same breath, and maybe it tallies back to the point about technology, we've still seen projects where European manufacturers are still being the preferred suppliers of equipment. If you look at companies like Siemens, or you look at a company like GE, it's American, but fighting head to head with the Chinese to supply equipment on power stations, and it's winning work. If we look at medical equipment, our government has bought a lot from GE, but also from some of the European companies like Philips. So again, I don't think we should make a blanket statement. And I've also seen a lot of these countries now, whether it's the US or some of the European Union countries, are really coming in and through export credit agency financing to assist their home countries really penetrate the market. So that has sort of created a good space in terms of making the products a lot more competitive. So I wouldn't say it's all doom and gloom, but yes, China is pretty strong. But there are still pockets where we find Europeans, and once the product really stands out, people also look at it benefit. There are a lot of people also who have not had very good experience with some of the Chinese suppliers from quality, and so maybe they're going back to some of the more traditional providers. But the ability to fund projects at a good rate is attractive. And also in a sector like dairy, some of the, especially in Denmark and Netherlands countries, doing quite a lot of the equipment supplies in that area, and in a sense holding their own against maybe import from a country like India, which is also quite big. So yeah, I think it's an open market in that sense.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeff. I'm actually quite grateful for this discussion of two high-level managers from two countries, one from Africa, one from Europe, and even online. Yeah, sometimes it's not so easy to discuss directly online, but we managed to do that. So, but let us turn now to our audience, and I want to ask the first question, which was voted most, and which was, I think, actually the first question put in here, which I do not see who it's coming from, but the question is, if COVID-19 told us something, then that locally developed for local needs has become more important. This is not a question, this is an assumption. Yeah. So local developed production, I guess, for local needs has become more important. And now the question, how is the transfer of knowledge to develop locally the communities for other companies to Africa? How is the transfer of knowledge for that going on? Who wants to respond to that? First, there's the assumption that what the pandemic is telling us is that now we have to produce locally for local needs, and therefore we need a transfer knowledge. Would you agree on that? Maybe Jeff, you start, as it's more for the African side.
I think the transfer would come to would be helpful, especially if it can improve on what's already available. I'll talk specifically to a market like Kenya. We've seen both our educational universities and also some of the companies pretty much on their own already create products, especially to deal with the post-COVID situation. And so anything else that comes would be incremental to that. Not that one is starting from scratch with absolutely nothing and the technology must be transferred for that to happen. I think local knowledge transfer, the transfer of knowledge really happens through the sharing of whether it's production processes, technologies, by having the sort of partnership Mr. Ludwig referred to with a company out of South Africa, who then invest and then start producing on a mass basis. There's no substitute for rolling up your sleeves and actually executing the work. And that really has to be done through local capacity building. And if it takes the form of a technical services agreement or a partial equity investment or a licensing or a franchising agreement, the model may be different. But I think at the end of the day, that has to be the key.
Okay. So local production for local needs, is it what the pandemic is teaching us, Andreas?
I mean, the short answer is yes, but I think we have actually seen the peak of this what we call globalization 10 years ago, which might surprise you. I think we have even in the previous U.S. administration, if you listen to some of the things Obama has been talking about, was already at the start of saying the answer cannot be that we globalize everything and everybody ships everything in from China. This whole political debate going on, for example, in America right now. So I think this trend has actually started before COVID. COVID now accelerates this to say, well, let's think about our supply chains. Is it smart that we have certain products which are exclusively produced in China or in India for the rest of the world? So yes, I agree. I think it would be a terrible mistake if we now say, therefore, global trade has to stop, because as Mr. Ganga said, trade is the global exchange of goods and services is at the key of the wealth creation for not only developed but also developing nations. So I think it is an opportunity, and my example with our mobile factory is exactly an example to say, okay, let's create. Let's produce local for local needs, and that's how we also transfer know-how, because I do not believe that you will get companies to transfer know-how without market incentives. You have to give business an opportunity to make money, and it's good locally, then they will produce locally and transfer know-how. I don't think transfer of know-how can be ordered by governments or anybody else, because it's not going to happen. So I think, yes, it's an opportunity, and COVID is maybe accelerating that process, but I think that process has already started way before.
Okay, thank you. That's a clear answer. Let's come now to the next question as time is going on. And this is one which was voted up quickly, and obviously it's from the European point of view quite interesting. How is the African-Chinese relationship changing in the course of the current crisis? And what could this mean for European companies? Who wants to answer that first?
Yeah, that's clearly a question for Mr. Gangla as the African expert.
I think certainly our trading sector, we have a big trading sector of people who go to China every month and import shiploads of different items, particularly consumer durables, which they then sell. And I think from February, they've just not been able to have any stock, if I can call it that. So how has that affected them? Basically, if they don't have an alternative source of raw material, then they are totally stuck, because the working capital is then invested and you cannot sustain that relationship. So if you're a trader sitting in Nairobi, then now you have to look to other markets as a potential source of goods, because it's the only way you can sustain the business. So I think a lot of the traders are now looking at markets. I think a lot of people are looking at Turkey has been sort of like an immediate source where cost of production is still low, especially for general goods. And talking to one or two of our clients, we've seen them really now look up to open that relationship with suppliers from that region. So certainly things have changed because of the disruption in the supply chain, and it just means that one has to diversify. The same way you diversify your sources of capital, you can't rely on one source. So you also have to diversify, whether it's your market of sale or your or your source of raw material.
So from an African point of view, does it also mean a diversification towards Europe?
Yes, I think in certain areas, certainly, like I mentioned, just talking to some of active traders in the market, Turkey has come up as one place which has been seen as a pretty much a good replacement for what people are sourcing from China. So Europe certainly has a good chance, but it comes down also to the competitiveness of the price. So it may not fit all the products, may fit some, maybe not all, but certainly traders look for where they'll get the same good and able to still make a decent margin without necessarily the market.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So here comes another question from, actually here I do see the name, from a long-lasting friend, Walter Meyer. How serious is the brain drain to other continents for Africa and how to avoid it? This also for Jeff, I think.
I've never really considered it to be brain drain per se. I just think that because of population growth in Africa and limited opportunities for people to really achieve their full potential, it's forced them to go outward and to be able to take advantage and make an impact in other markets. And that has become a primary source of forex for the region. So I don't necessarily think that if all the Africans stayed in Africa, Africa would necessarily be better off. If anything, by these people going out and achieving what they have, they've created a huge impact. I look at an example of an African businessman like Strive Masiyiwa, who runs one of the biggest Pan-African telcos. He did what he did in Zimbabwe, and then he moved out and went to South Africa. But he's built now a Pan-African telecom business. So would you consider it brain drain to Zimbabwe? Really? Not necessarily. But what Africa has to do is to continue investing in skilled people and to create better working conditions so that it's equally attractive to continue to work in Africa.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Relative thing, brain drain, in which direction? Andreas, there's one question for you. Could you please give some examples about Umdash Group projects for building local capacity in Africa, besides contractual jobs and revenue?
Well, to be honest, no, I don't have any other examples. I mean, we do, as I described, try to work on projects through distributors now, and this new initiative with Neuland. But our core focus is construction. That's our business. So if I understand the question, we do not do anything but trying to do the business of our core expertise.
Yeah, businesses should stick to their core business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I think we have to look at the time, and maybe one question coming back now to African European collaboration. What is the opinion of both of you in terms of mindsets? Should there be some change in mindsets on either side, or on which side should there be some? Who wants to respond to that?
Go for it, Mr. Ludwig. I'm just going to collect my thoughts.
Yeah, please call me Andreas. I don't know if it's a change of mindset. I think what COVID does, and which was actually the start of our discussion, is I think it is causing a global change of mindset in so many ways. In terms of, look at how we are doing this conference, which we wouldn't have done that way probably half a year ago, and Bernhard would have organized us all to get together somewhere and sit and debate. I hope that this will not go away, but I think the use of new technology, for example, as we do right now, I think certain things obviously will change the mindset of people because of this new pandemic situation. Travel will change. Again, businesses which until now have thought can never fail, all of a sudden we learn that your sales go to zero within 2 weeks, which any business person I know has done planning and budgeting, but nobody ever built a scenario with zero sales, right? So yes, I think our mindset is being forced to be changed right now in this specific situation. I don't think that particularly applies to the European-African relationship. I still believe that there is opportunities for both sides of the equation, markets, developing markets, fast-growing consumers in Africa with huge needs. If you look at the construction industry, if I look at where some of the mega cities in the next 20, 30 years will develop, most of them are in Africa. There's huge need for construction. We need to change the technology we're using, otherwise we'll never be able to build it. So yes, there is a mindset change needed, but I think it's more of a global challenge than particularly an African one.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think that obviously COVID has disrupted how everything has been set up, how we work, how we live, how we play, how we go to school. But if you look at the central thesis around Africa and what has made Africa an attractive investment destination, I don't think that has changed. And so for any investor looking to play in this market, you need to look at it in the long term and look at where Africa has come over the last 20 years, the progress it has made. It's not finished product yet, it's something in transition. And there are still a lot of huge opportunities across different sectors. And I think every year we sort of, I think, even surprise ourselves because we wonder where has this come from, even when things look tough and you see what has happened in the real economy. I think these economies are transforming pretty quickly. So there's a lot of opportunity. I think the narrative is a lot better than maybe 20 years ago. I think if you just look at a single statistic, for the last 10 years, most African countries have kept inflation at single digit. If you look, most African countries have grown minimum 3% consistently, closer to 6 or 7%. If you look at industrialization, if you look at infrastructure, Chinese have obviously played a big part in deepening Africa's infrastructure, but so too have other territories who have invested, and that to me is going to continue, and that really is the basis on which anyone looking out to Africa should say, what are the prospects for Africa for the next 20, 30 years? Do I want to play in this space? And if so, how? And in this COVID, with all these changes, what are the immediate short-term opportunities? But the long-term, I think, still very, very strong.
Yeah, and may I add to that what you said before? A new generation is coming in on a continent with half of the population below 19 or so.
I think it's below 25, probably more. And you see this in the basic industries. regardless of how much income you have, you can only eat so much bread in a day. And if you look, the guys who do maize milling, wheat milling, rice, that's growing because of the population. So as people get more money, they sort of switch their preferences. So if before I was eating maize meal every day, now maybe I'll eat rice twice a week, spend a bit more, but again, I'm still within that same age set. And that's why I say something like food security. When we look at even our statistics over the last 10 years, and you look at the growth in the different categories, it is still very strong. Education, one of the reasons why a lot of investors are putting money in education is with the population explosion, the government was not able to grow the facilities at the same rate. So if you go to a government institution in Kenya, you're maybe having 50 pupils to one teacher. It's a very high ratio. So as the middle class grows, people are opting to take their children to private schools. For a moment, don't imagine private schools are only in the slum areas. I mean, are only in middle and upper class. Even in slum areas, you have private schools in slum areas which cost a bit more than government and actually sacrifice a lot to take their children to those schools and take a lot of pride in trying to better the lives of their children in future. So I'm very excited about, if you call it the basic services that you need, the food, shelter, healthcare, education, and that really is what, to my mind, will continue to anchor demand. We obviously have sectors like tourism, which have been good, but they are also very volatile. And a market like Kenya, tourism is still a big earner. But right now, the sector is shut. Almost all the workers have been sent on unpaid leave. If you're a property owner, we've seen a huge influx. Maybe 30 tier 1 hotels have opened up in Nairobi in the last 2 to 3 years. Most of them are not operating. So if I've borrowed to be able to develop that infrastructure, all of these are owned by private sector, Africa, local and international. And all of a sudden you have no cash flow. So where does that leave you? And so for me, my thinking is really look at the basic stuff. You sort of want to have a bit more peace of mind, because either way, people will always find a way to buy sugar, rice, milk, things like those.
Mm-hmm. So look at the basic stuff. Yes, thank you. Let us, at this point, let us bring in our audience again. And in relation to the African-European collaboration, let us turn to a poll. So I ask you to switch on this column with polls. Publish polls. And I would, sorry, this is, may I ask Imke to publish the poll we have here? We want to ask the audience, what is the biggest obstacle for successful African-European collaboration? We are really interested in your opinion now. Is it a lack of rule of law? Is it the Chinese competition? Is it finding a local partner? Is it communication, financing, lack of political will, European mindset? And I can see coming in first answers. Lack of rule of law is right at the top. Andreas has advocated for that. I could say advocated in a mixed sense of meaning, yeah. But yeah, half of our audience in the moment, they're still answering coming in, is the opinion that lacking rule of law is the main obstacle for African-European collaboration. And on the second place is finding a local partner. So the audience is quite in opinion what have been said. And as time goes on, we are coming to an end now. I really want to thank our distinguished guests, Mr. Geoffrey Ganglia, Mr. Andreas Ludwig. We really had the opportunity to talk to high-level managers from 2 different countries, one in Africa, one in Europe. And I hope that we have altogether have got some new insights. This has been our third webinar of doing business, of this series, Doing Business in Africa series. The first one was on connecting with African startups. We had Kenyan and Rwandan participants here and could explore the Kenyan-Rwandan ecosystem. The second one was on managing the new VUCA world. We were connected directly to Nigeria, where VUCA is the world, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. This is what we are facing now in Europe, which is new for us in a way, but not so new for African countries. And this time we were talking about collaboration, African-European collaboration in the new normality. This webinar was a collaboration, I have to say again, between corporAID and NextAfrica. From NextAfrica, I send my warm gratitude to the colleagues from corporAID. And thank you to all the participants at the screens who contributed in the chat, in the questions and the polls, and with your attention. I hope we could explore a little bit the topic on how the new normality might look like in the future. Please look up the websites and newsletters of us. I again want to thank Geoffrey and Andreas for their very valuable participation, for their engagement. And I want to ask Bernhard on stage now, maybe for his last word. And from my side, I wish this was a small step of bringing people, businesses from Africa and Europe together. Bernhard.
Thank you, Hans. I think we have all experienced a very interesting webinar with many good interactions and absolutely enriching food for thought. Thanks to all of you for attending, for participating, for putting questions, etc. Special thanks, of course, go to Geoffrey and Andreas for the valuable insights and for the open discussion, even sometimes a little bit controversial discussion. And of course, thanks to Hans for his input and his excellent moderation. I'm very sorry, as always, that we cannot go on networking face-to-face now with a drink and some snacks, as we usually do after corporate multilogues. The only way we can continue, but we can offer is to keep the webinar open for an hour or so, so that you can do some networking via the chat tool. And Imke, the good fairy in the background, has already put, I think, the link to the corporate newsletter in the chat room, so they can see it there. And then please register for it and stay informed about our activities at the corporate platform. And it's also important, we're looking forward to all kind of feedback from your side. Please help us improve on this kind of webinar. We'll hope to continue it soon. And that's it. Goodbye. Thanks to everybody, and have a good day. And keep